Hello, everyone. A good morning to all of you and welcome to our immigration webinar today. I'm Jenny Blofeld-Rautanen. I work at KPMG Finland as a senior manager. We have a very wonderful set of presenters here today with you. My colleague Anna Kurronen from KPMG Finland, Emma Juhl from Denmark, Unn-Kristin Mardal from KPMG Norway, and Nina Dahlsten from Sweden. And let's have a quick look at the agenda slide as well. We will be discussing immigration processes to each of the Nordic countries today and touch upon recent developments as well. In many countries, there's also upcoming legislation changes, which will be discussed during the presentation. And at the very end, we also want to give you a sneak peek to our tool, KPMG Immigration Expert. And as you can see, we are happy to take questions and answer, at least at the end of the webinar. If we do have an opportunity, we'll also answer in between. And for this, we ask you to please write your questions in the webinar chat window, which should appear on the right-hand side of the webinar screen for you. And just to mention, we are also recording this session and you'll have the opportunity to listen to it afterwards as well. But please do enjoy, and let's have our first presenter, Anna, present on Finland.
Good morning, everybody. Also from my side, I am Anna Kurronen and I work at KPMG Finland with immigration, relocation and posted worker matters. Today I will briefly introduce to you Finland immigration principles, and then we look at some recent and upcoming changes in more detail. You can move on to the next slide, please. Here we look at the immigration process in brief. So the immigration process to Finland depends on mainly three factors: the citizenship, duration of stay, and thirdly, the activities performed in Finland. And here you can see the main differences based on citizenships. For Nordic citizens, the decisive factor for the process is the citizenship and the duration, less or more than 6 months. Second category are the citizens of EU member states, Liechtenstein and Switzerland. And for those nationalities, the decisive time limit is 90 days or 3 months. Both Nordic and EU citizens can start working immediately, even before completing these registrations. Then the third category is all other nationalities, which in general need a residence permit to Finland before starting work. Finnish residence permit is sort of a 3-in-1 card, so the same permit gives the right to enter, stay and work in Finland. In some cases, it is possible to work without a residence permit for a maximum of 90 days. For example, as a specialist who has been invited to work in Finland or has a contract in Finland. But the stay must always be legal, so the person would in any case need a valid visa or visa-free citizenship or a residence permit issued by another Schengen state. And depending on the permit type, it may be also possible to apply for the permit from Finland. But most common is to apply for the permit from abroad before entering Finland. And in principle, for these citizenships, residence permit is needed before starting work. There are some exceptions, such as this 90-day exemption that I mentioned, or then, for example, refugees or those who have left Ukraine and applied for temporary protection in Finland. Here we have also listed the estimated processing times for some of the most common permit types. The estimated processing times here apply to online processing, which is the preferred way instead of paper applications. And the applications are submitted online via Finnish Immigration Services online platform called Enter Finland. And if family members apply for the residence permit together with the employee, the processing time of the family members' permits follow the main applicant's processing time. But if the family members would apply later on or separately from the main applicant, the processing times in that case are much longer, currently estimated even 9 months, which is a huge difference compared to the times that you can see here. And finally, as a reminder, if an employee is posted to Finland, it's important to check the posted worker requirements, such as whether the posted worker declaration is needed. We can move on to the next slide, please. And next, we look at the fast track process that was implemented in Finland in June. The fast track processing applies to these residence permit types that you can see here on the right: specialists, startup entrepreneurs, and their family members. The fast track processing does not currently apply to researchers, and based on our discussions with the authorities, at the moment there are unfortunately no plans to extend it to researchers. However, there is overall development with automation of the permit processing, which would then hopefully also speed up the process for researchers and other permit types. And I will later on talk a bit more about that. So the basic principle of the fast track processing is that it guarantees a quick processing of the application via automation. But what has made perhaps even a bigger impact in the process is that it guarantees a biometrics appointment in 5 days from the application submission. And this is a big improvement because in some countries, the queues to get the biometric appointments have been even several months long. And then one of the benefits of the fast track process is also that it speeds up the process once the employee is in Finland. There is also a fast track for local registration for those who have gotten the fast track permit. And via this fast track processing, the local registration might be received even in 1 day, whereas currently it might take even up to 2 weeks for other employees at the moment. And this certificate is needed, for example, to open a bank account, so it makes the settling in Finland easier if it's obtained faster. Also, together with the fast track, Finland implemented a national D-visa, which would allow entry to Finland even before the actual residence permit card is received. So it makes the process also a bit faster in that sense. Delivering the residence permit cards take usually 2 to 3 weeks, so that has also then been reduced from the process. There are some additional requirements for the fast track process. The application must be submitted and paid online via the online system that I mentioned. And in that same system, employer must add the terms of the employment within 2 working days. The applicant must also prove their identity within 5 working days from submitting the application during the biometric appointment studies then offered to the person. And then how has this been going in practice? Based on our experience, this has indeed been living up to the expectation and the promise of 14 days, which has been great to see. The additional requirements related to the fast track in our experience have been quite straightforward to follow. There have been some challenges related to the online payment because the payment can only be made via Finnish online banking credentials or an international credit card. And at the moment, for example, applicants from Russia and Iran can have difficulties because they might not have an international credit card due to the sanctions. But even from these countries, some applicants have been able to pay their applications with the help of an international friend, for example, who has let the applicant use their credit card information and make the payment. So they have been able to apply via fast track. But if the applicant drops from the fast track, it's not the end of the world. So then the application is just processed under the regular processing. We can move on to the next slide, please. And on this slide, we have described the fast track process for a specialist in a more visual way. So it's the same process as described on the last slide. But here we have also included whose actions are required at which point, and the timeline needed for the preparations, because there are some preparations that need to be taken before submitting the application, such as preparations for setting up the employer account on Enter Finland online platform. And regarding the filing of the information in Enter Finland for the employer, this is something that KPMG can also do on behalf of the employer if we are authorized. And here it's also good to notice that if documents would require legalization, then the document gathering phase would take longer. So it always depends on the country where the document has been issued, whether legalization is needed, and then also possibly translations depending on the language. We can move on to the next slide, please. And next, we will take a look at the current topics and changes in Finnish immigration regulations, and there are quite many of those at the moment. Firstly, at the end of September, Finland placed more restrictions on Russian citizens' tourism to Finland after the mobilization in Russia was announced. Finland has stopped the issuance of visas based on tourism for Russian citizens, and visas issued by Finland can be revoked at the border if the conditions of entry are not met. And this means tourist visas. Entry tourist visas issued by other Schengen states can be denied at the border, but however, Finland would not revoke visas issued by other Schengen states unless another Schengen state would request Finland to do so. But the good thing is, however, that the border remains open for persons entering for essential purposes, such as visit family members or business reasons, as well as for people traveling to Finland with nationality visas or Finnish residence permits. And there are no changes expected to this. Then related to extension applications, it is planned that the Finnish Immigration Service will in the future, early 23, get income information directly from the Finnish Incomes Register. This would facilitate the extension applications. So in case the salary, benefit or pension is paid in Finland, then the applicant would not need to provide this information and pay slips anymore, but the authority would get this directly from another authority. And then also related to the war in Ukraine, Finland is planning an extension for the residence permits for those who have received temporary protection in Finland. So currently the residence permits are valid until March next year, but Finland is planning a national amendment to the law to automatically extend these to 24. And this proposal is expected to be given to the Parliament during this autumn. And this would be a provisional amendment to the Aliens Act. We can move on to the next one. And also, there are quite many changes coming up to the Aliens Act. Several amendments have been proposed, and the purpose is to make the residence permit process for a work-based immigration easier and the processing faster. This new legislation is intended to enter into force already in December. And the goal is that the work-based residence permit processes would have an average processing time of 30 days by the end of the government term, which ends in 23. And this would be achieved via automation in the application process. And also what is a important change is this certification of employers, which has been proposed in the proposal. This would be a sort of a pre-check of the employer. So the employer would provide certain information and documentation and apply for the certification, which would be then granted for a fixed term of time. And this would mean that the applicants would not need to provide same information for each application after the employer has been certified. And certified employers would also be able to provide the information on employment terms directly to employees' applications. And this would speed up the process, or could speed up the process in two ways, both by freeing resources for other permit types, and then for certified employers, this would make the process smoother. The amendments also include clarifications on several topics, for example, the right to work in Finland without a residence permit. So this would be clarified that it would only concern employees who intend to work 90 days and not more. But we keep on following these changes and will be communicating these later on when these come into effect. Thank you. You can move on to the next slide, please.
Yes, hi and good morning everyone from Sweden. My name is Nina and I work as an immigration specialist with KPMG in Sweden in our office in Gothenburg. A bit of background about me. I have been working with KPMG for about 5 years. Before that, I was also working with the Swedish Immigration Agency as a case officer. So today I will be giving you a brief explanation about how the work permit process in Sweden works and what the requirements are to obtain a Swedish work permit. We will also go through some news from last year and this year for the work permit application process. So yeah, let's start and move on to the next slide. So how do you apply for a Swedish work permit? Well, to start with, we can just establish that if you are a citizen of an EU country, you do not need to have a work permit to be allowed to work in Sweden. So this regulations that I will be talking about is applicable for non-EU citizens. And when you apply for the work permit, the first step for local hires, those who are being locally employed in a Swedish company, is that the position must be advertised with what we in Sweden call Platsbanken, in English the Public Employment Service, for at least 10 days before we can start the application process for the work permit. And in general, it is only this Public Employment Service platform that is accepted for the advertisement by the migration agency. So if you in the past have advertised the relevant position, for example, on your website, that is normally not something that the migration agency will approve for a work permit application. So very important when you start the application process for a local hire in Sweden, that the position has been advertised correctly, because otherwise the migration agency will not approve the work permit application. Something to also keep in mind about the advertisement requirement is that the employment contract should not be signed before the advertisement has been completed. And this is something that the migration agency is in fact checking in each and every application. The next step of the application process would be to prepare the so-called offer of employment, which is a government application form that we file with the work permit application. In the offer of employment, we present the terms of employment, such as salary level and insurance coverage. And this is a very important part of the application process, since the migration agency, when looking at the work permit application, will review salary level and insurance coverage and make sure that it is in line with the Swedish collective agreements. If the salary level or the insurances are not in line with collective agreements, the work permit application will generally be rejected. And the way to determine this, if the terms of employment are okay, is that before we file the work permit application, we always need to send the offer of employment to the relevant trade union so that they get the opportunity to give their opinion on the offered salary and the insurance coverage. If your company has a collective agreement, all local employees are generally covered by the mandatory insurances. If you don't have a collective agreement, then you need to make sure that people or employees holding a work permit has a health insurance covering loss of income if you have sick-related absence from work, a life insurance, an insurance for occupational injury, and also an occupational pension. And once we have the offer of employment approved by the trade union, we can file the application to the migration agency. And as a general rule, the employee who is applying for the work permit is not allowed to be in Sweden during the processing time of the application. And that applies also to like pure visits or vacation. They are not allowed to enter Sweden at all during the processing time of the application. Family members of the employee can be included in the application. And what is counted here as family members are married spouses, cohabiting partners who have been living together for at least 6 months before the application is filed, and also children up to the age of 21 years old. So the employee and the family members can then file a joint application. When the work permit is approved, the employee can travel to Sweden and there is no need to apply for a separate visa. However, if you come from a country whose nationals generally needs a visa to enter Sweden, you need to obtain the residence card from the Swedish embassy in the home country before you can travel to Sweden. If you have a nationality that does not need a visa to enter Sweden, you can travel here as soon as the work permit is approved and then obtain the residence card once you have arrived in Sweden. So this is sort of an overview and very like basics of the requirements to obtain the Swedish work permit. We will now move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about the new rules on permanent residency that was introduced last year. So in the summer of 2021, new regulations on permanent residency was introduced in Sweden. It has been more than a year, but the new rules are still causing some uncertainties and some actually issues for some applicants. The changes in the legislations are mainly connected to family members of work permit holders. Before, they would usually just get a permanent residency by default when the employee got the permanent residence permit. However, since last year, we have new and stricter rules for the family members. And the biggest change is that all family members over the age of 18 needs to have their own employment in Sweden to get the permanent residence permit. And it really doesn't matter if you have a spouse in Sweden with a work permit who has perhaps a high salary and is able to support you financially. The spouse will not get the permanent residence permit if they do not have their own employment in Sweden. And this has come as quite a surprise to many people living in Sweden. The new rules were introduced on short notice, and many have expected to just get their permanent residence permit without having a job in Sweden, which now is not possible. If the family member does not have an employment in Sweden, they can still get a temporary extension of the residence permit. But enable for them to get this temporary extension, their spouse working in Sweden needs to be able to support them financially, and they must also have an accommodation in Sweden of what is called sufficient size and standard for the whole family. And so for the accommodation, that has actually been something causing some issues from what we have seen in the past year. And the reason for that is mainly that when we have someone who does not have what we call a first-hand rental contract in Sweden, but a second-hand contract, the migration agency is reviewing if the second-hand contract has been approved by the landlord or by the housing association. And as some of you perhaps know, the housing market in Sweden is very difficult, especially in the bigger cities. So if you move to Sweden, it can be very hard to find a first-hand rental contract. So many people having work permits actually do have these second-hand rental contracts. And from what we have seen this last year, it happens quite often that the second-hand rental is not approved by the housing association. And that would lead to issues with the family's residence permit extension. So that's something really to keep in mind and to check well in advance before it is time for an employee to apply for the permanent residency. And moving on, we also have some newer updates and hot topics for immigration to Sweden. We have a new set of rules that were introduced on 1st of June this year. And the biggest part of that is that we now have to submit a signed employment contract with all work permit applications. And as I mentioned before, the employment contract cannot be signed before the advertisement of the position is completed. And this is something that has not really been reviewed in the past because we have never had to submit the actual employment contract. So in the past, the migration agency only looked to see, did we start the work permit process before the advertisement or not? But now they are actually looking at the dates when the contract was signed by the employer and the employee. There is also a new rule saying that if the terms of employment gets worse, like the salary gets low, we have maybe not as good as an insurance coverage as what was stated in the work permit applications. This needs to be informed to the migration agency before, for example, the salary is lowered. Another new rule is that the Swedish time-limited work permits are no longer limited to a maximum of 4 years in total. This is something that we see as really positive. In the past, the legislation said that you can have a time-limited work permit for a maximum of totally 4 years in Sweden. Then you have to apply for permanent residency. Now this could actually cause some issues, especially for people maybe commuting or working temporary in Sweden, going back and forth between Sweden and the home country, because they in the end would have had a work permit temporary for 4 years. So they couldn't apply for another temporary residence permit. On the other hand, they didn't spend enough time in Sweden to qualify for the permanent residence permit. But this 4-year maximum has now been abolished from the legislation, so you can continue also after 4 years to reapply for temporary residence permits. Some other hot topics in Swedish immigration. It has been decided from the Swedish government that a requirement on Swedish language skills should be introduced to obtain the Swedish citizenships. We are also seeing discussion on perhaps having the same requirement for permanent residence permit, but that has not been decided yet. But we know for sure that there will be requirement on speaking Swedish to get Swedish citizenship. It has not yet though been presented like on what level you need to have the Swedish language knowledge. There will also be a minimum salary level increasement for work permit applications. As with the language skill requirement, it has been decided that this will be implemented, but we don't know when, and we don't know what the new minimum salary level will be. And this is basically something that has been decided on since the Swedish government want to sort of reduce the number of work permit applications that is related to low skilled work types. We also just had an investigation from the migration agency being presented on the possibility to limit the extent that the student permit holder is allowed to work next to their studies in Sweden. At the moment, international students holding a residence permit for university studies in Sweden, they do not really have a limitation on the extent that they are allowed to work next to their studies. And what we have seen in the investigation that was recently released is that with focus on some particular nationalities, these groups are taking advantage of the system and are not completing studies and only working instead. So we can expect that there will be some changes in this legislation in the future. Also something that was been made published just a few days ago, so we didn't even have it included in the presentation, is that from 1st of November, in 2 weeks, there will be a new requirement for Swedish work permit applications saying that all applicants need to show their original passport when they apply for a work permit. If you're not already living in Sweden, it should be done at the Swedish embassy or consulate in your home country. And for people who needs a visa and residence card to travel to Sweden, this will not really make a big difference in the process because they need to visit the embassy to get their residence card anyways. But the big difference would be for those work permit applicants who do not need a visa to enter Sweden and in the past have been able to just travel here as soon as the work permit is approved and then obtain the residence card here. They will now have to make a visit to the embassy in their home country to show their passport before their permit is approved. So this sort of adds an additional step of the application process for them. And at the moment, we do not have any specific details on exactly how this step of the process will work. What we know for now is that at least in the beginning, the migration agency will contact each applicant when they should visit the embassy to show their passport. And just a few reminders for you to take with you from today also for Sweden. We do have the fast track application system for work permits in Sweden. Under normal circumstances, the processing time should be 10 business days for a new work permit application and 20 business days for an extension. However, during this year, processing times have been much longer. Right now, I would say about 2 to 3 months for a first-time application and 4 to 6 months for an extension. We know that the migration agency is working on shortening these processing times, but this is what we are seeing right now, how long it's taking to get the work permit, even under the fast track certification. Also, a reminder about the posted worker directive. If an employee is posted in Sweden to perform a service for a Swedish service recipient, the posted worker notification is required from day 1 in Sweden. And that was all that I had from Sweden, and I will now leave the word for the next country.
Well, thank you, Nina. My name is Christine, and I'm working in KPMG in Norway in the global mobility practice. I've been here for 15 years now, working both with tax and immigration. And prior to that, I worked 5 years with the Directorate of Immigration in Norway. So I'm hoping that this will enable me to give you an introduction to the immigration in Norway. We will focus on the application process and the timelines. And if you could just switch to the next slide, thank you. So this is basically the same information that was provided both by Anna and by Nina with regard to the requirements in Norway. So it's just a different visualization of the same information. Basically, the further away from Norway you live and have your nationality, the stricter and more comprehensive the immigration regulations are. So for the Nordic countries, there's no immigration requirements in Norway, and you're allowed to start working immediately. And there are some registration, but they are all related to tax. So applying for tax card, meeting for an ID check, and reporting salaries and so forth. But for immigration, there's no obligations for the Nordic countries. Moving further away to the EU and EEA countries, you're also allowed to start working from day one. If you're going to stay in Norway for more than 90 days in a 180 days period, you need to do what we call a simplified EU registration. If you're going to stay for less than 90 days, there is no obligation at all. So either way, you can start work from day one. And then further away, third countries, as we call it, if you are from outside the EU or EEA area, you need to apply for a work permit before you can start work in Norway. And you need to wait until your permit has been granted before you can start work. You will also then see that the regulations and requirements for obtaining a permit is more strict. There's requirements with regard to the level of your education, and there's requirements related to minimum wage salaries. So it's really important that all the requirements are met in order for you to qualify for the work permit. We can move to the next slide. So this is the application process for the typical third country applicant. So the process is a combination of online filing and personal attendance with the immigration authorities. So the first thing to be done is to register and to set up an electronic user with the UDI application portal. When you've set up your ID, you can find the correct application form for the permit that you are applying for, typically either a local employment or an assignment in Norway. Those are the most common ones. When you've filled out the online application form, you need to also prepare the supporting documents, and the documents required are obviously it's the passport, it's a picture, it's a copy of the CV, it's documentation of the education of the person traveling, previous work experience, and power of attorney if you are to be represented by either your employer or by KPMG. So when you fill out the online application form, there's a possibility for you to book a meeting to submit your supporting documents. If you are represented by your employer or by KPMG holding a power of attorney, it's possible to, instead of book a meeting and wait a long time perhaps for an available appointment, that you can upload documents electronically. So this is only an option if you have assistance from your employer or another power of attorney. So you would then send a notification to the police to notify that you have filed the online application, and then the police will issue a case ID number and an authorization to upload the supporting documents. And when this has been received, it takes 2 days normally, you can upload all the supporting documents electronically, and it will definitely save some time with regard to waiting and meeting in person. When the documents are uploaded or filed, UDI will start the processing. So from this time, the UDI processing time starts. When UDI has processed the application, they will issue their decision. If the person is from a country that has a visa waiver agreement with Norway, meaning that they are allowed to travel into Norway and stay here without applying for an entry visa or a different kind of visa, they can travel to Norway immediately. If it's a country where there's no visa waiver agreement with Norway, that would typically be India, that we see a lot of cases from India, then UDI will automatically, as part of the processing, notify the embassy in India that the permit has been granted. And then the embassy will cooperate with the visa service centers in issuing an entry visa so that the employee will be able to submit their passports, get their entry visa, and travel to Norway. So there's no additional application required for the entry visa. When the permit is granted, we must again log into the online system to book this second meeting for the effectuation. So that's a meeting where the applicant will have to meet in person after they have arrived in Norway to verify their ID and to take the biometrics for their residence cards. So in this meeting, they will meet in person. They will take their picture, fingerprints, and signature. And based on this, they will be issued a credit-sized kind of residence card confirming their right to work in Norway. And this card will then be sent to the employee's registered living address or work address in Norway. So that is basically the application process. I have commented save time here, and that is because normally a person is only allowed to start work after they have had their effectuation meetings, so this final meeting. There can be a long waiting time for these meetings, so that would typically end up with just an increase on the total processing time and a delay in this possibility to start work, which is very unfortunate. So we have been able to get an agreement with UDI. It's a kind of a post-COVID thing that they have not, agreed to uphold for some time for KPMG. So we are allowed to send them notification and ask if the employee can start working while waiting for the appointment. So after they have been granted a decision, however, before they have had their effectuation meeting. So this is, if you get assistance from us, we will at least be able to save you a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks in this final stage of the application process. Okay, next slide. Processing times. So this is where the bad news start, or at least they have been bad news for very long. So prior to COVID, the UDI, they had processing times of 30 days. But when we were hit with COVID, they had to reorganize the resources. They didn't get any new resources, so the people processing applications for work permit had new tasks as well. So what happened was that the processing times increased significantly. So in just a short time, it increased from 30 days until 4 months. And for some applications, the oldest one, even longer than 4 months. So this has been a really challenge for all our clients because you want people to start work as soon as possible. And we have had many issues and cases where this is a big problem. So still, when looking at the webpage of UDI, which is in this slide, you can see that they are still stating 4 months. But we have seen from the latest cases that we have that processing times has decreased significantly. So for the last cases we've had, we've received the decision between a month and a half from uploading the documents, which is really good. So they are aiming to go back to 30 days. I have a feeling they are soon there, but they won't put it officially out there because they can't guarantee. They are working on the backlog from both sides. So the newest applications, if everything is prepared properly, they will process them as soon as possible. There's a slide here as well about prioritized processing, because that's the question we get a lot, obviously, since the processing time has been so long. Unfortunately, UDI has prioritized on working on the backlog. They are not prioritizing any cases, at least not unless there is a very good reason. So typically the need to have an employee starting work as soon as possible is not sufficient. So it's been cases where there are death in immediate family for family immigration cases, or if there is maybe children, accompanying children who are planning to start school in Norway, then we have seen also that they have accepted that the employee gets a sooner processing. So only in very rare cases has that been possible. Okay, next slide. Fast track, we were also asked to comment on fast track because we have seen now that both in Finland and in Sweden this is offered. Studies have been made in Norway as well, and there are some snips here on the slide, and you can see the wording that they have been using here. Norway did not participate in the studies. They are referring that most EU members have this process, but Norway unfortunately does not. I think that as long as they can keep to the 30 days processing, that is sufficient in most cases. However, we are still in dialogue with them. We have regular meetings with the immigration authorities, and we are continuing to inform them about the options that they have in the other Nordic countries, and trying to argue why should Norway be worse off. And I know that they have had study trips to go and visit the immigration authorities both in Denmark and in Sweden at last. But so far there's no fast track in Norway. So can we compensate in any way? Well, I'm not sure. There's a regulation on early employment start in Norway. It's not put into effect because it will require the police and UDI to spend resources on processing the early work start applications. So they have just decided that this is something they will not do. It can be something to use KPMG as a power of attorney or the employer, because then you can upload electronically, as I said. What should be investigated is obviously if there are any exemptions to the work permit requirements, because there are some exemptions that are relevant for businesses and for certain assignments in Norway. Typically, a third country national who is employed within EU, working in an EU country, which is part of the permanent workforce and has a valid work permit in that country, then they would not require a work permit in Norway. They can practice the EU regulations and start working from day one. Another exemption is the typical technical experts or people on business trips to Norway. Then they can, if certain criteria are met, they can come to Norway and start work here for up until 3 months without applying for a work permit. And also some offshore work on the mobile installations can be done without a work permit in Norway. So there are also additional exemptions. So it would be maybe good if you have cases that are really urgent to consult with us and to see if we can make this fit into one of the valid exemptions in the Immigration Act. And obviously also we do have a very good relationship and close cooperation with the immigration authorities in Norway. So we have regular meetings to discuss the situation and the regulation and how the market is evolving. We have close contacts in, so we are able to get clarifications on the difficult cases really fast. And this is something that we have seen has been quite a good help for our clients during COVID and all the entry restrictions we've had and the difficulties over the past few years. So then the next slide. Yeah, a few words about the status for Ukraine and Russia. So for Ukraine, we have decided that there is a collective protection for Ukraine nationals, so they do not have to apply and have their applications processed individually. And they get permits to stay. They get for 1 year at a time. It's processed really fast, and it can be extended for a year at a time. So this gives them the right to then both health benefits, they can work during their stay here, and also the children can attend school. With regard to Russian nationals, we heard Anna mention that in Finland they have stopped issuing visas, visitor visas for Russian nationals. The Ministry of Justice in Norway has had some wording on this lately, and it's been informed that Norway is following the situation closely. We do not have the same situation in Norway as in Finland. We do not have that many coming. So for now, there's no restrictions and no border control, so to say. But there is a close eye on the situation, and they have warned that changes can come at a very short notice. But so far, it's still possible to apply for visas. It might be processed more strictly. And if you have a work offer, you can apply for a work permit the same way as any other third country national. Yeah, the next slide, which I believe is the final one for Norway. This is just a brief summary and our best advice to you, and that is always, due to the processing time, start the process early. Be thorough when preparing the document so that the first documents you upload is the correct and final one, so you don't have to go additional rounds and have delays in the process because of the documents that's been uploaded or missing. Use the opportunity to file via power of attorney, because then you can use the electronic uploading option. Check if there's any exemptions available for your employees that will come to Norway. You can also plan if you have a large workforce. Perhaps if the processing time is long and it's crucial for you to have resources on board immediately, perhaps you can use someone within EU or employed with an EU part of your company. And if you are assisted by KPMG, at least we can assist you in having an early start after the permit has been granted, so that your employees don't have to wait until the permit has been effectuated. We've been told that there's very often questions related to the posted worker directive and the status in the different countries. So in Norway, it's slightly different than in the other Nordic countries, because we don't have the posted workers registration as you know it from the other Nordic countries. It doesn't mean that we don't have the same obligations. It's just not linked to the immigration process, and it's not new in any way, because when we in Norway discovered oil at Ekofisk in 1969, they needed to have a lot of foreign workers present in Norway to develop the oil and gas fields. So already in the early 70s, Norway introduced very strict and comprehensive reporting and registration regimes. So we do have this. You have to register all the employees. The foreign employers needs to be registered. You need to report the salaries. There are minimum salary requirements, etc. However, it's not part of the immigration process, and it's not facilitated by the labor authorities like it is in many countries. It's part of the tax process in Norway. So yeah, if you have any questions to any of this, I hope that you will address them in the chat, and we will respond, of course, and also maybe afterwards if you need to reach out, we are happy to assist. So then I hand you over to Denmark and my colleague Emma.
Hi everyone, my name is Emma and I work as a consultant at KPMG here in Denmark. And just to briefly mention, as there are no immigration requirements for Nordic citizens and for EU citizens, the registration is simplified. Today I will just go over the application for a Danish work and residence permit for third country nationals. So let's just get started. Can I skip to the next slide? Thank you. In Denmark, third country nationals must have a valid work and residence permit in order for them to perform work. The application is submitted online at the Danish Agency for International Recruitment and Integration, shortly SIRI, and the web portal is called Ny i Danmark. There are several ways to obtain this work and residence permit in Denmark. The most used that we see are through the pay limit scheme or the fast track scheme. The standard condition for both schemes are, among others, that the salary must be paid into a Danish bank account, the salary must correspond to Danish standard, and the offered terms of employment must correspond to Danish standard also. If we just look at the pay limit scheme, there is a salary threshold. The threshold is regulated each year, and for 2022, the threshold is 448,000 Danish kroner each year. The current processing time for the if the application is submitted under the pay limit scheme is around 1 to 2 months. If we instead look at the fast track scheme, it is an easier way for Danish employers to get foreign labor working in Denmark. The first condition is that the Danish company must be certified by SIRI. This is an application that is submitted online, and there are different conditions must be met in order for this Danish company to be certified. But one of the conditions is that there must be at least 20 full-time employees working at the Danish company. The current processing time for this certificate from the filing date is approximately 1 month. In addition to being a certified company, one of the conditions for the fast track scheme is that the employee must have been offered one of the different types of fast tracks. And in Denmark, we have 4 different types of tracks, and the most used ones that we see are applications submitted under the short-term track and on the pay limit track. If we just look at the short-term track, it can be used for if an employee has been offered a contract here in Denmark with a maximum duration of 90 days within 1 year. And when using the short-term track, there is no obligation that the salary must be paid into a Danish bank account, and the salary must just correspond with Danish standards. So there's not this salary threshold as there is with the pay limit. And if we just look at the pay limit track, there's the salary threshold and the condition that is the salary must also be paid into a Danish bank account. Can we just skip to the next slide? Yeah, and here I've just lined up the application process from start to finish. And if we just look at the first step, it is to create a case order ID online at the website Ny in Danmark and pay a public fee of 4,405 Danish kroner to SIRI. And the next step is the online application form. The application is filled out and submitted online, and the documents that are needed to submit this application is a copy of the employee's passport, including all blank pages, and a copy of the front and back cover. We need a copy of the employee's CV, and if the employee and employer is represented by KPMG, we will also need a power of attorney in order for us to submit this application on behalf of the employee. Then we will also need a signed employment contract, and we will need a copy of the employee's diploma translated to English. After the application has been submitted, the employee will need to obtain the biometrics. And the place of biometrics is different whether or not the employee is a visa-free or obligated to hold a valid visa. If we just look at the visa-free nationals, they are allowed to obtain their biometrics here in Denmark at the Danish Agency for International Recruitment and Integration, and the documents that they will need to bring to this appointment is just a copy of the payment received that the 4,405 Danish kroner has been paid, and a copy of the receipt that the application has been submitted online. If we instead look at the nationals that are obligated to hold a valid visa, they will need, if they do not currently hold a valid visa, they will need to obtain their biometrics in the current country of residence. And the appointment for this biometrics is booked online through the VFS portal. And the documents that are needed for this appointment is a copy of the payment receipt, so the same for the visa-free nationals, and then a copy of the receipt that the application has been submitted, and a copy of the filled out application, and also a copy of the payment received to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, as when the biometric is obtained outside of Denmark, there is a fee of 1,600 Danish kroner that need to be paid to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Furthermore, at some VFS offices, there's also a local fee that must be paid directly to the VFS office. So if we look at the last step, that is the approved application. If we have a visa-free national that had obtained their biometrics here in Denmark, and the application is submitted under the fast track scheme, then the employee will receive what we call a provisional work permit at the appointment, meaning that they are ready to start working the day after the day of their biometrics appointment. If instead we look at the nationals that are obligated to hold a valid visa, then they will need to wait until the Danish immigration authorities has processed the case and issued a final work permit, and then they will go to the diplomatic mission in their current country of residence, and this mission will issue a Schengen visa sticker that will be put into the employee's passport, meaning that now they are allowed to travel to Denmark. The current processing time for a final work permit under the fast track scheme is approximately 2 to 3 weeks. And for the pay limit scheme, as I mentioned earlier, there is a processing time of 1 to 2 months after the biometrics has been taken. If the application is submitted under the fast track scheme, there is also the possibility to apply for what we call a quick job start, meaning that from the biometrics has been obtained to the final work permit, the immigration authorities have 10 days to process this case. So this is very helpful in urgent cases. And can we just, also I want to say, if the employee that are moving to Denmark have some family members accompanying them, they are also allowed to stay here in Denmark, but they will need their own residence permit. The documents that we will need in order to file the application is a power of attorney, a passport, a copy of the marriage certificate if it's spouse and it's translated in English, and a birth certificate on the children under the age of 18, and that should also be translated into English. The accompanying family members are allowed to work on the residence permit. However, if the dependents are employed by the same Danish company as the original employee, they will need their own work and residence permit in order to perform this work. And can we just skip to the last slide? Yeah, and here I've just listed some of the current topics and new legislation on Danish immigration. And I just want to mention that Russian nationals are allowed to reside and work in Denmark. However, they are obligated to hold a valid visa. And if they do not hold such visa, they will need to obtain their biometrics in their current country of residence as a starting part. However, all VFS offices are currently closed in Russia. So the employees will need to travel to another country that they're legally allowed to reside in, like, for example, Kazakhstan, and then they must obtain their biometrics here. After they have obtained their biometrics, the process is just the same as with any other nationals that are obligated to hold a valid visa. And if we just look at new legislation on the topic of Danish immigration, there is a proposal to a new legislation on the topic of immigration here in Denmark, but we have not yet seen the final bill, so it's just a proposal still. But one of the points from this proposal is regarding the salary threshold for the pay limit scheme. So the current salary threshold is 448,000 Danish kroner each year, but the proposal suggests a threshold of 375,000 Danish kroner. Another one of the points from this proposal is the number of full-time employees working for a Danish company in order for the company to get certified for the fast track scheme. Currently, the condition is that there must be at least 20 full-time employees working at the Danish company, but with this new proposal, there should only be 10 full-time employees working for the Danish company. But as I just mentioned before, we have not seen the specific bill yet, so this is just a proposal to new legislation. And that was all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all my colleagues. We received some quite interesting information on all the countries, and we have a set of questions that came in as well. So let's look at answering those. And the first one goes to Norway, and actually there's a set of questions for Norway, Kristin, for you, but to start with, and this is actually something you already summarized, but just to be more specific, when a third country citizen is working permanently in an EU country or EEA country and is posted to Norway, we summarized that there is an exemption in place and work permit needed, right?
Yes, exactly, Jenny. So if this employee is employed and part of the permanent workforce of an EU company or a company registered within EU, and also they have a valid residence permit in that specific country. So typically an Indian national who is working in a Danish company and has a residence permit in Denmark, then they can be sent to work on an assignment in Norway using the EU regulation. So they don't have to apply for a work permit to work in Norway. They can travel to Norway, start work from day one, and do the EU registration if they will exceed the 90 days threshold. So that's correct.
Right. All right. And then we do have another question from Norway. In a situation where an international, or what has to be done when an international assignment or an employee from a third country becomes a local employee in Norway? Does the permit, for example, have to be changed?
Yes. So typically, if a person who has been on an assignment and has a permit, work permit as a seconded employee or service provider, which is the term used in Norway, changes to a local employment, they have to file a new application based on the local employment. On the contrary, if a person who has a work permit based on a local employment wants to change their employer, there's not a need to apply for a new permit just because you change your employer if you're going to work in the same kind of work. So if you have the same position but you change your employer, then you do not have to apply for a new permit. But if you change from an assignment to a local employment, you have to apply for a new permit.
All right. And is it so that the family member process would follow the same logic?
Yeah. So family members can join. Most workers in Norway, if you have a local employment, you can bring your family. If you are a service provider and you're going to stay for more than 6 months, you can also bring your family. If you stay for less than 6 months as a service provider, you're not allowed to bring your family. And the application process for the family is the same as for the employee. It's online and then a meeting afterwards. And if they file the application at the same time, they're also processed at the same together. Normally, the processing time for family members are longer than for the workers, but if they're filed together, then they are also processed together. So the process is basically the same.
All right. And in terms of the timelines, you already mentioned that in your presentation, but what have the timelines to get a residence permit and work permit? What has it looked like?
Yeah, so the official timeline is 4 months, but as I said, we have seen lately in recent cases that it's been decreasing, and they are working on the backlog, and we have recently received from 1 to 2 months. So my guess is that by the end of the year, I hope we will be back to the 30 days. But obviously, this is not something that either UDI or we in KPMG can guarantee, because the official statement is 4 months. But basically, in reality, I think it's shorter, closer to 1 to 2 months.
All right, thank you very much. And the next question we have would go to Anna, my colleague in Finland. So we actually have an interesting question related to Finland and the upcoming legislation changes. And the question is, could the certified employers change influence also the family members' residence permits? Yeah, could the family members be applying for permits? Could that process also be a little bit faster than what it has been currently?
Anna, you're muted.
Processed.
I think you have to start over because
Okay.
I did not hear your
Some
voice.
technical issues. Thank you. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, the basic principle is that when the family members apply together with the employee, the same processing time applies to family members as for the employee. So following this logic, then if the employee's residence permit is processed faster, also the family members' permits are processed faster. But it remains to be seen whether this 9-month processing time, which applies to family members who apply separately, could be shortened. So about that, there is no information yet.
All right, thank you very much, Anna. And we had one more question for Sweden mainly. And this is a very specific question. We have a situation where a third country national from Turkey is going from Netherlands to Sweden to do some installing work for 14 days. And the person possesses a residence permit card to the Netherlands. And the question is this traveler sufficient with EU registration? And can we understand that he does not need a visa or work permit?
Yes, so there are a number of exemptions from the work permit requirement in Sweden. And one of them covers non-EU citizens who are living and having a residence or work permit in another EU country, such as a Turkish person who lives and has a permit in the Netherlands. And if they are temporarily going to perform installation work, for example, for you as a company, then they are exempted from having a work permit.
All right, thank you very much. And I think as a follow-up question, we also were to comment on whether this is similar for all the countries, so Finland, Denmark, and Norway. Maybe Anna, you can comment on behalf of Finland.
Yes, so based on the background information about this few weeks installation, and the employee would hold a valid residence permit in the Netherlands, it looks like also the person would be exempted from residence permit to Finland. But in this case, it does sound like that the posted worker notification would need to be submitted.
All right, thank you very much. We can continue forward, and if there's questions we did not have time to answer, then definitely we're happy to separately have a look at those and get back to you after this webinar. Let's have a quick look at our Global Immigration Expert tool, which is also something that you can consider using to help you get quick assessments on the immigration process timelines, the documents needed to different countries. But let's have a look at the next slide we have with a short summary on our tool. Some of you may have already heard or seen our presentations on the Global Immigration Expert. It is a solution that provides 24/7 the possibility to have a quick pre-assessment done on the immigration requirements. You can find all the Nordic countries in this tool, but you can find a lot of other countries as well globally. And this can, of course, be used for the mobility function itself to support businesses, decision makers in planning their international projects and assignments. On the next slide, we have a list of the countries that are currently available in the tool, 66 countries. Pretty much all of the big destination countries are in the tool, so you can do a quick check on the immigration process. You can also see, for example, what business visa options there would be to a certain country. You can do a comparison on the immigration processes to different countries. We also have recently updated the tool with Brexit updates, posted worker directive information, and COVID information for those countries where it still is relevant. And there's some countries that we still intend to add to the tool. Next ones to be added are Georgia, Greece, and Saudi Arabia. If you're interested to hear more about this tool, definitely be in contact with me and my colleagues. And of course, if you have any further questions on immigration to any of the Nordic countries, we're always here to help you out. As you heard, my colleagues have a lot of practical experience on the processes and relevant experience to probably many of you. So please feel free to be in contact with us. And rest assured, I can see that there's more questions. Unfortunately, we have not had time to check and go through the list of the questions, so we'll definitely do that and get back to you separately. But thank you very much for your time, and I hope you had a good start to the day, and we hope to hear more of you and stay in touch.